Chapter 6 Topics. The Cipher Dispatches. Tilden's address to the people of the United States in regard to them. His examination by a congressional committee. A calumnious report corrected. Repudiates a reported arrangement between the Senate and House committees to exempt his bank account from examination. Letter to Senator Kernan. Mr. Tilden did not realize all the advantages to his health from his European trip that he had hoped for. His adventures in crossing the English Channel undid much of the very considerable benefit which he seemed to have derived from it. While his general condition was improved, he could not disguise from himself the fact that his tremulousness was increasing, that his vocal organs were losing their flexibility, and that his left arm and hand were less useful to him than when he left his home. Though his health had now become a somewhat more serious preoccupation than formerly, he did not yet regard it as entitled to interfere materially with his future plans or customary occupations. His renomination for the presidency in 1880 was regarded as a matter of course by both parties, not only because he was immeasurably the most capable and popular candidate his party had to present, but because he was the only candidate his party knew could win. Mr. Tilden was the only one candidate through whose election the nation could properly resent the wrong it had sustained at the hands of the Electoral Commission in 1877. He was now regarded by the administration, not only as a more formidable candidate than in 1876, but the consequences of his election now were regarded as more alarming than in 1876, especially to those who had participated in the frauds which put Hayes into the presidency. He was treated, therefore, from the very beginning of the Hayes administration as the one man in the nation who, at all hazards, must be destroyed. This could not be accomplished by assailing his public life, his opinions, or his public teachings. That had already been tried pretty faithfully and had proved unsuccessful. A second attempt was certain to prove even less successful. There was one course left. The Potter investigation had satisfied the nation that Hayes had not been elected by the people, and that the majority of electors for him had been secured by fraud. To this there was no longer any defense, not even the benefit of a doubt. The only thing to do under those circumstances was, not to attempt to justify the installation of Hayes, but to persist in efforts to leave upon the public mind an impression which should stay there until after the next election at least, that Tilden and his party were just as bad as Hayes and his party. Plus the risk of Tilden's being overruled by his party, and that the people had nothing to gain by a change of dynasty. As the administration had control of all the judicial, civil, and military forces of the government, and necessarily exerted a prodigious influence over all the organs of public opinion, this did not seem at the time a hopeless endeavor. It is no exaggeration to say that the administration used all these forces with the energy and recklessness of despair. I am aware that this is a grave allegation, quite too grave to rest upon the unsupported dictum of any individual. Early in the month of October of 1878 a series of telegraphic dispatches in cipher, purporting to have been addressed to well-known partisans of Mr. Tilden during the electoral crisis of November and December, 1876, appeared with translations in the New York Tribune. These dispatches conveyed the impression that persons holding more or less familiar, not to say confidential, relations with Mr. Tilden had been entertaining propositions for the purchase of the electoral vote of one or more of the contested states. I do not propose to leave it thus unsupported, but to produce such evidence as will, I think, bear conviction to any unprejudiced reader, that during the whole 4 years of Hayes's administration, and regardless of Mr. Tilden's age, his physical infirmities, his priceless public services, and the place which he occupied in the hearts of his countrymen, Tilden was pursued by the agents of that administration with a cruelty, a vindictiveness, an insensibility to all the promptings of Christian charity which men are rarely accustomed to exhibit except in their dealing with wild beasts. The fact that the votes of many of the electors were notoriously in the market at prices which would scarcely have been a month's income to Mr. Tilden, and that he needed but a single one of them to secure the presidency. This helped to give currency to this abominable suspicion, which received additional aliment from the appearance of the name of his sister's son, who with his wife and child was a guest with her in Tilden's house at the time, among the alleged negotiators. Mr. Clarkson N. Potter, also a chairman, and Mr. Bullock passed over to Mr. Brady, who, while Second Assistant Postmaster General, had, with 3 special agents of the Post Office Department, attended the canvass in Florida, and must have been acquainted with everything done there, such of the abstracted dispatches as had not been destroyed, and such others as they did not prefer to suppress. The facts developed subsequently to the inauguration of Mr. Hayes, as follows. First, the acknowledgement by the administration of Mr. Hayes that the Democratic state officers in Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina had been legally elected, although in the 2 former states they received fewer votes than were given to the electoral ticket of Tilden and Hendricks. To show the motive which animated the parties through whose agency these dispatches, legally as well as morally, in the strictest sense of the word, confidential, came to be public property. It is necessary to go back about 2 years and trace their history from the time their hallowed privacy was first violated, until they were spread out in the columns of an intensely partisan journal. On the 23rd and 24th of January 1877, certain telegraphic dispatches relating to the election in Louisiana were delivered to a committee of the House of Representatives. Mr. Morrison, a Democrat, was chairman, and certain other telegraphic dispatches relating to the election in Oregon were delivered to a committee of the Senate, of which Mr. Morton, a Republican, was chairman. Pursuant to the direction of Mr. Sargent, chairman of the subcommittee of the Morton Committee, on the 25th day of January, about 30,000 telegraphic dispatches, purporting to be all the reside of dispatches relating to the election, were in the possession of the Western Union Telegraph Company. They were delivered to Mr. Burbank, a brother-in-law of Mr. Morton, and also the clerk of his committee, or to his temporary substitute. Mr. Orton, the president of the Western Union Company, whom Mr. Tilden did not hesitate to characterize as an unscrupulous Republican partisan, had previously permitted his party friends to withdraw some of the dispatches. This appears to have facilitated the surrender of the rest to the control of the chairman of the Republican Senatorial Committee, thereby practically excluding everybody else from the privilege of inspecting them. The particular dispatches, sent to Morrison Committee, were returned. The other dispatches were retained by the officers of the Morton Committee until some time after the inauguration of Mr. Hayes, and were then, except such as in the meantime had been abstracted, returned to the Telegraph Company, and afterwards burned by its order. Some of the dispatches which had been abstracted were, more than a year afterwards, in the possession of one George Edward Bullock, of Indiana, who had been a messenger of the Senatorial Committee, and was a protégé of its chairman, Mr. Morton. This Mr. Bullock obtained from Mr. Hayes the appointment of consul at Cologne, upon the recommendation, among others, of Thomas J. Brady, of Indiana, the second Assistant Postmaster General, afterwards so notorious as the head of the fraudulent Star Root Ring. Upon the eve of his departure, and after the appointment by the House of Representatives of the Committee of Investigation into the election frauds in Louisiana and Florida, the publication of some and the suppression of the rest of these dispatches proved to be the only weapon within their reach, and ignominious and lawless as they knew such a violation of private correspondence to be, they did not shrink from resorting to it. Second, the appointment by Mr. Hayes, to most important offices, of the members of the returning boards of Louisiana and Florida, and all of the persons who had been actors and instruments in the frauds perpetrated by those boards. This includes the 2 electors whose names were forged in the corrected electoral votes of Louisiana, and the persons who were privy to those foreign forgeries. This led to a new investigation by a committee of the House of Representatives, of which Mr. Clarkson N. Potter, of New York, was chairman. After this committee had been some 6 months pursuing its investigation, and had developed facts which carried conviction to the minds of fair men of all parties as to the gross nature of the frauds which were made the basis of a false count by the Electoral Commission, it was manifest that something had to be done, and at once, to counteract the moral effect upon the country of these disclosures. The dispatches that were published show, what was confirmed by the uncontradicted testimony of the witnesses examined before the Potter Committee, that unequivocal offers were made by persons representing, with every appearance of authority, the returning board of South Carolina, and a majority of the state canvassers of Florida, to give the Democratic candidates for presidential electors official certificates that they were duly appointed, for money considerations to be paid after the delivery of such certificates. It was proved that the agent of the South Carolina returning board, after his offer was rejected, went to the city of New York to repeat and press his offer, and stayed there several days in the vain endeavor to have his offer accepted. It was also proved, by unimpeachable testimony, that the offer in behalf of certain of the state canvassers of Florida as repeatedly made through various persons. It was further proved that similar offers in behalf of the returning board of Louisiana were made to Mr. Hewitt, chairman of the National Democratic Committee, and to others. These offers were prefaced by statements that, if not accepted, pending transactions with the Republicans would be consummated, although involving more risk, because in that case the certificates would be contrary to truth. All the power of the Hayes administration, vainly struggling to justify its own existence, and all its means of influencing the press, were exerted to create a suspicion against Mr. Tilden that in some instance he had entertained or given countenance, directly or indirectly, to such negotiations. These efforts totally failed. They were not only destitute of the slightest foundation, but they were so contradicted by every intrinsic probability as to be absurd. All were disproved by the concurrent testimony of every witness who was examined. Their only pretext was, that the South Carolina and Florida offers had been communicated to one of the nephews of Mr. Tilden, though the fact had been kept secret from Mr. Tilden. How far that gentleman was led into this indiscretion by a desire to learn the tactics of the adversary, or to gain time and means to prove and to defeat their strategy when it should be completely developed, or to secure the opportunity of submitting the matter to members of the Democratic National Committee, whenever it should assume a definite form, does not clearly appear. It is certain, however, that he took no second step, and all negotiations of this character were rejected and abandoned. The great controlling fact stands, that none of these offers were accepted, nor their conditions complied with, by any of Mr. Tilden's friends, nor were the certificates of any of the returning boards or state canvassers given to the Democratic electors, to whom they rightfully belonged. On the other hand, those certificates were all given to the Republican electors, although at the expense of numerous frauds in the canvasses, false authentications by the governors of 3 states, and the forging of the signatures of 2 electors. Whether for these felonious transactions bribes in money were paid according to the offers which the actors in them professed to have received, has not been proved. But that bribes in the more effectual form of appointments to lucrative offices were actually given to all the felons is now a matter of authentic history. Mr. Potter, in his report, made the following sagacious remarks. If a man be bribed by a sum down, he may lose it or waste it, and then the control it gave him will be gone. But in an office which he holds at the pleasure of the person who appointed him, he is under continuing control. When the first publication was made, about October 7th, I went to see Mr. Tilden. I found him very much affected. He was very indignant that the existence of such compromising communications should have been kept from him so long. He begged me to stay with him a few days. He was completely overcome than I had ever seen him before. He regarded these dispatches as I did, as the reply of the administration at Washington to the Potter investigation. It having been established by the Potter Committee to the conviction of the whole nation that Hayes was not elected, the administration, instead of continuing the defense of Hayes' title, determined to show, if they could, that Tilden was bad enough to have been elected by the same means that Hayes had been. Fortunately, the facts that were no longer in dispute protected Tilden's character. Only one vote was required to elect Tilden. It was in proof that the votes of 3 states were in the market, and at a price which would have been but a trifle to Tilden. 2. Tilden did not get that vote. Nor was there a particle of evidence that any money was ever furnished to anyone by Tilden, or anyone else on his account, to secure the one needed vote. 3. Hayes needed all the votes of the 3 states. All were for sale. Hayes got them all and was elected, and within 6 months after his inauguration every person known to have been concerned in securing or giving those notes, from the highest to the lowest, received an office or an offer of one. The position in which Mr. Tilden found himself placed by the publication of these telegrams subjected him to the humiliating necessity, for the first time in his life, of making a public defense of his personal character. He lost no time in preparing and sending the following statement to the press. New York, October 16, 1878. To the editor of the Herald. Sir, I have read the publications in the Tribune of the 8th instant, purporting to be translations of cipher telegrams relating to the canvass of votes in Florida at the presidential election of 1876, and have looked over those printed in the Tribune of this morning relating to the canvass in South Carolina. I have no knowledge of the existence of these telegrams, nor any information about them, except what has been derived from or since the publications of the Tribune. So much for these telegrams generally. I shall speak yet more specifically as to some of them. 1. Those which relate to an offer purporting to have been made in behalf of some member of the State Board of Canvassers of Florida, to give, for a pecuniary compensation, certificates to the Democratic electors who had been actually chosen. None of these telegrams, nor any telegram communicating such an offer, or answering such an offer, or relating to such an offer, was seen by me, translated to me, or the contents of it in any manner made known to me. I had no knowledge of the existence or purport of any telegram relating to that subject. Nor did I learn the fact that such an offer of Florida certificates had been made until long after the 6th of December, at which time the certificates were delivered and the electoral votes cast, and when the information casually reached me, as of a past event, it was accompanied by the statement that the offer had been rejected. 2. As to the publications in the Tribune of this morning, purporting to be translations of cipher telegrams relating to the canvass of votes in South Carolina in 1876, which I have seen since I wrote the foregoing, I can speak of them no less definitely and positively. No one of such telegrams, either in cipher or translated, was ever shown to or its contents made known to me. No offer or negotiation in behalf of the state canvassers of South Carolina, or any of them, or any dealing with any of them in respect to the certificates to the electors, was ever authorized or sanctioned in any manner by me directly or through any other person. I will add that no offer to give the certificates of any returning board or state canvassers of any state to Democratic electors in consideration of office or money or property, no negotiation of that nature in behalf of any member of such board or with any such member, no attempt to influence the action of any elector of president and vice president by such motives, was ever entertained, considered, or tolerated by me or by anybody within my influence by my consent, or with my knowledge or acquiescence. No such contemplated transaction could at any time have come within the range of my power without that power being instantly exerted to crush it out. A belief was doubtless current that certificates from the state of Florida, conforming to the actual vote of the people, were in the market. I have not the slightest doubt in the world, said Mr. Saltonstall, who was in Florida at the time, in a recent interview with the Herald correspondent, that Florida vote could have been bought, if Mr. Tilden had been dishonorable enough to desire it done, for a great deal less than $50,000 or $20,000. It was known that either one of the two members who composed a majority of the Florida state canvassers could control its action and give the certificates to the Democrats. Either one of them could settle the presidential controversy in favor of the Democratic candidates, who lacked but one vote. How accessible to venal inducements they were, is shown by the testimony of McLean, the chairman of the Board of State Canvassers, in his examination, before the Potter Committee in June last. He admitted that the true vote of the people of Florida was in favor of the Democratic electors, and that the fact even appeared on the face of the county returns, including among them the true return from Baker County, notwithstanding the great frauds against the Democrats in some of the county returns. He also confessed that in voting to give the certificates to the Republican electors he acted under the influence of promises that he should be rewarded in case Mr. Hayes became president, adding that certainly these promises must have had a strong control over my judgment and action. After the certificates of the Louisiana Returning Board had been repeatedly offered to Mr. Hewitt and others for money, they were given in favor of the Republican electors, who had been rejected by a large majority of the voters, and the members of this returning board now possess the most important federal offices in that state. The pregnant fact always remains that none of these corrupt boards gave their certificates to the Democratic electors, but they all did give them to the Republican electors. I had perfectly fixed the purpose, from which I never deviated in a word or act, a purpose which was known to or assumed by all with whom I was in habitual communication. If the presidency of the United States was to be disposed of by certificates to be won from corrupt returning boards by any form of venal inducements, whether of offices or money, I was resolved to take no part in the shameful competition, and I took none. The main interest of the victory which resulted in my election was the expectation that through the chief magistracy a system of reforms, similar to that which had been accomplished in our metropolis and in our state administration, would be achieved in the federal government. For this object it was necessary that I should be untrammeled by any commitment in the choice of men to execute the official trusts of the government, and untrammeled by any obligations to special interests. I had been nominated and I was elected without one limitation of my perfect independence. To have surrendered or compromised the advantages of this position by a degrading competition for returning board certificates would have been to abandon all that made victory desirable, everything which could have sustained me in the larger struggle that victory would have imposed upon me. I was resolved to go into the presidential chair in full command of all my resources for usefulness, or not at all. While thus abstaining from an ignominious competition for such certificates, I saw these certificates obtained for the Republican electors, who had not been chosen by the people. These false and fraudulent certificates, now confessed and proved to have been obtained by corrupt inducements, were afterward made the pretexts for taking from the people their rightful choice for the presidency and vice-presidency. These certificates were declared by the tribunal to which Congress had abdicated the function of deciding the count of disputed electoral votes to be the absolute and indisputable conveyance of title to the chief magistracy of the nation. The state of Florida, which had united all her executive, legislative, and judicial powers to testify to Congress, long before the count, who were the genuine agents, which had by statute caused a recanvass, the issue of new certificates, and a formal sovereign authentication of the right of the true electors to deposit the votes entitled to be counted, was held to be incapable of communicating to Congress a fact which everybody then knew and which cannot now be disputed. Congress, though vested by the Constitution with the authority to count the electoral votes, though unrestricted either as to time when it should receive evidence, or as to the nature of that evidence, and though subject to no appeal from its decision, was declared to have no power to guide its own count by any information it could obtain, or by any authority which it might accept from the wronged and betrayed state whose vote was about to be falsified. The monstrous conclusion was thus reached that the act of one man, holding the deciding vote in a board of state canvassers, for without his concurrence the frauds of the other ruling boards would have failed, in giving certificates known at the time, and now by himself confessed to have been obtained by the promise of office, certificates whose character was known months before Congress could begin the count, must prevail over all the remedies powers of the state of Florida and of the Congress of the United States combined, and must dispose of the chief magistracy of this republic. S.J. Tilden. Not content with this formal disavowal of any knowledge or participation in any negotiations for the exercise of any improper influence over the returning boards, Mr. Tilden addressed a subcommittee of the Potter Committee, then sitting in New York, the following note. 15 Gramercy Park, February 7, 1879. To the Chairman of the Congressional Committee. Dear Sir, I learn from the public press that it is the desire of your committee to terminate its session in this city during the current week. I take the liberty of requesting that before you leave an opportunity be permitted me to appear before you to submit some testimony which I deem pertinent to the inquiry with which you are charged. Very respectfully. S. J. Tilden. The subcommittee consisted of Hunton, of Virginia, the chairman, Springer, of Illinois, Stenger, of Pennsylvania, Hiscock, of New York, and Reed, of Maine, the first 3 Democrats and the last 2 Republicans. On Saturday, the 9th of February, by special arrangement Mr. Tilden appeared before the committee. It was a fearful ordeal. He was very feeble. His voice was scarcely audible above a whisper. By the treachery of political foes and the folly of political allies he had been suddenly cast down from a popular eminence rarely attained by any American, to the degrading abyss of a quarter-sessions criminal, with the popular sentiment of the nation more or less infected by the poisonous breath of hostile partisan press. The situation was enough to have paralyzed and crushed a man of less nerve, less conscious of his ability to demonstrate the factious motives which had placed him in that position, and with less conscious of his ability to demonstrate the factious motives which had placed him in that position, and with less faith than his in the ultimate triumph of innocence and justice. The audience chamber was crowded almost to suffocation. Since the examination of Dr. Franklin by the Privy Council in London, in 1774, there has been no public hearing, I believe, in which there have been such vast and grave interests at stake upon the testimony of a single individual. The occasion was one of unusual impressiveness, especially when the cross-examination commenced. It soon became apparent that the Republican examiners were in the hands of their master. Before they had finished, Tilden had changed places with them, and put them on the stand in defense of the administration. The following graphic account of the scene appeared in the New York Herald of the following morning. At 11:30 Mr. Tilden appeared, in company with his brother, Henry A. Tilden, and ex-Secretary of State Bigelow. Mr. Tilden was dressed in black, and had an air of great solemnity on his face, which looked as imperturbable and sphinx-like as ever. Since his last public appearance he seemed to have aged considerably, and yesterday he looked quite ill and feeble. As he afterward explained, he was suffering from a severe cold. It was, indeed, quite a painful spectacle to see the slow, halting, lame walk with which he passed the table and reached his seat. His figure was stiffly drawn up and seemed incapable of bending, as though he were suffering from a paralytic contraction of the limbs. As he entered, every eye was curiously turned upon him. Not a muscle of his face relaxed with animation or expression as he stiffly extended his hand to Mr. Reed, of Maine, who received the salutation with something like a profound bow. Then Mr. Tilden gave his hand to Mr. Hiscock, the other Republican cross-examiner, and after saluting the Democratic members took off his elegant, silk-lined overcoat, stiffly turned round and seated himself at the table, while settling at the same time a large handkerchief in his break pocket. Ex-Governor Tilden sat erect in his chair for over 2 hours and a half, and during the greater portion of this time he gave his testimony in that calm, quiet, imperturbable manner peculiar to him, and without hardly moving a muscle or changing the expression of his countenance. His voice, which was hoarse, started very feebly, almost inaudibly. But as Mr. Tilden came to the corrupt negotiations alluded to in the cipher dispatches, his hoarse voice rose suddenly to a pitch of loudness, vehemence, and dramatic intensity hardly ever observed in the ex-governor during the most exciting periods of his life. During these portions of Mr. Tilden's evidence there was a flush of deep feeling over his face, and the mental excitement had such mastery over him that his lips twitched, and one of his hands, said to be smitten with paralysis, trembled in a most painful manner. And when Governor Tilden dramatically called on heaven and earth to witness the protestation of his innocence of all knowledge of the ciphers, bringing his clenched fist heavily down upon the table, there was a sympathizing outburst of applause. There was only one relieving glimpse of humor during the entire examination lasting over 2 hours and a half, namely when Mr. Reed, of Maine, questioned him about corrupt attempts, and the governor returned dryly, attempts to sell or buy, at which there was some laughter. When the cross-examination had been concluded Governor Tilden held quite a whispered conversation with Mr. Hiscock. The moment Tilden withdrew, which he did in the same slow, halting, imperturbable manner in which he entered, the interest of the day seemed to have ended, and the audience thinned out within a few minutes. End of Chapter 6 Part 1. Next up in Chapter 6 Part 2 will be the word-for-word testimony given by Mr. Tilden at the Potter Commission.